WP-Get Web Dev Tutorials for all user levels. Okay guys, I just wanted to run through an idea for a common issue that we see in Elementor or any other builder with JavaScript. And what it is, you might have a HTML widget that you put on the page here, you want to put some script into. And if you do something like this here, which is just a, for example, jQuery selector and then call faden, that's not going to work. It will actually generate a JavaScript error, and the reason for that is because jQuery hasn't loaded when this HTML code is being processed. So this code's kind of in the middle of the document. jQuery is actually loaded generally at the end of the document. So this could be GSAP, locomotion, could be anything. So any dependency that you need that you want to use in these widgets or anywhere else needs to be loaded before you can actually use it. So that's a common issue that I see with code. So one solution that you see a lot is using these interval timers. So basically we set a timer variable and create an interval that runs every, in this case, half second, so 500 milliseconds, where it's looking, in this case, for, on the window object, it's looking for jQuery. If it finds it, clears the interval, and then inits the code, calls this code down here. So that just keeps going round and round and round in circles until jQuery is loaded. So it works in most cases, not very eloquent, because if jQuery doesn't load, this just keeps going round and round in circles. And it's not exactly a good way of doing it because you don't know what the problem is because there's no errors that are echoed out or anything. So it's really a too simplistic way of doing it. But once jQuery has appeared on the window object and we call it init code, we can then run our jQuery because we know that it's loaded. It does work, not eloquent. So I've got a different way I've come up with doing this, which I think is better. It does require some additional code, but once it's there, it's very simple to use. So if we look at down here, just look at these first two lines of code here. So basically what I'm doing is I'm pulling a check dependencies function, a debug function, and a globals object from window.wpgutils, which I'll show you how I get that there. So I'm just pulling those from window. So this needs to be, the code needs to be loaded before this point. So we can use the, if you've got Elementor Pro, we can use the custom code and we can stick it somewhere up near the header or before other scripts are loading in the footer. It depends on how you want to do it, or in your functions.php file, whatever you want to do, or an external script if you want to put in an external script. But either way, this external code that I'm going to show you has to load before this point here. We then can call our check dependencies with an array of what are we looking for. I've just said, for example, jQuery and GSAP. What event name do we want to fire if it succeeds, so if it finds these, and what event name do we want to fire if it fails. Simple so far. Then all we have to do is on the window object, we have to add an event listener for the success listener. So what happens on success? In this case, we can just debug out some start of code. You could put whatever you want there. That can be your initialization of your code to interact with other widgets, whatever it is. Or if it fails, then we want to debug something out to the console, bring up a pop-up, whatever you want to do. So at least there's some way of notifying if it succeeds or fails. Now the cool thing here is that that needs to be done once. So that doesn't actually need to be in this HTML5 widget. That could be in a a custom code where you use code snippets or Elementor's custom code. That part there can be there, and then you can listen to it, listen to these events on any other object or script. So it could be another script you're loading, it could be an HTML5 box, whatever. Once you've said, okay, I want scripts that depend on jQuery and GSAP, all you have to do is then listen for the success or the fail. So I can have 5 of these HTML boxes, all just listening to this. And this is what I'm going to do on success, and this is what I'm going to do on failure. So whether you show a warning, whether you add a class to a div, whether you bring up a pop-up, it's up to you. But once this bit's done, this is all you need to do to know whether you've got the dependencies or not, and continue on. All right, now the way I've done this also, it is asynchronous. So the checking for your dependencies does not interfere with your JavaScript execution. It basically runs asynchronously in the background. Now, JavaScript is a contentious thing where JavaScript is actually not a multi-threaded language. So it doesn't fire up a separate thread, but what it does, it puts it into a queue further down the thread, checks whether it needs to run. If it doesn't, it shifts it further down the queue. So it just keeps shifting and shuffling it until it needs to run, and it doesn't interfere. So I will show you what I mean by that. So if we head back over to my IDE, I'm using IntelliJ IDE here. And I'm just going to bring up this window here. So here's my script here, and I'm just going to refresh this on the right-hand side here. And you see we've got our first dependency check, end of script, all dependencies found, and then start init of code. Now, if we look through here where those actually appear, we've got our first dependency check here when we check for the dependencies. So that ends up there. End of code is way down here. So that's run second because basically it's called this check dependencies, which has then done the first dependency check, which resolved because they found the dependencies. It then went on to the next end of script, and then in the background this happened. So that's just moved it down and the way I do that, I'm just going to go into that, sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. So first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to have a check interval. So how often we're going to check. So I'm going to check every 200 milliseconds. And I'm going to wait for up to 1000 milliseconds. So after a second, if my scripts haven't loaded, there's some problem. So I don't want to sit there waiting for more than a second for these scripts to load. We'll talk about this debugging stuff a little bit later. So what I'm doing in here is when I call my check dependencies, it's what dependencies, which is an array. What do I want to fire on success? What do I want to fire on fail? Then I use this await keyword here. Now the await keyword expects a promise, a JavaScript promise, which you can then use the then, catch, etc. And what this does is that makes it asynchronous. So that actually sticks it into the queue. If it's other scripts that need to run, it just keeps shifting it down the queue. So it doesn't interfere with your JavaScript execution. So we await for this check dependencies promise. I'll come back to here. Check dependencies promise up here. Basically, we're debugging out first dependency check. So here's our first dependency check. We're running a promise. We're setting a timer to an interval. We're looking at how many dependencies we actually found. We're looping through each of the actual dependencies in the array. If the dependency is on the window object, then increase our dependency found by 1. If our dependency found count equals the number of dependencies that we've actually got, we've found all our dependencies. So clear the interval and resolve this promise. Okay, resolve, I'll show you that a little bit later. Otherwise, if it hasn't found all the dependencies yet, we're going to add the check interval to our elapsed time. So we're going to add 200 as our check interval to our elapsed time, which starts at 0. And if the elapsed time is greater than the timeout, clear the interval of the timer, debug that we didn't find anything, and reject this. In other words, we had an error, we didn't find all our dependencies. Okay, so only if we've gone past the elapsed time, we're going to reject this. We're going to do debug saying we're doing a next check. So I don't see that here because my script's loaded before that 200 milliseconds. I think when I looked at this, it was actually something like 50 milliseconds that loaded. And let me just bring that up. 103 and 105. I think they're asynchronous. 62, 73. So these are loading very quickly anyway, which is why I'm not seeing the second attempt. If it took more than 200 milliseconds, I would see a second attempt where it would say next check. Okay, so you get the picture, what it's doing. All right, so promises, if you're not familiar with them. So JavaScript promise basically has some methods on it. So I've waited, so I've asynchronously done this dependency check. Then it means that I've resolved it. So if I, on the promise, if I tell it to resolve, it then runs the then, which expects a function. So I'm using an ESX function here. All I'm doing is creating a new custom event with the name on success and dispatching that event. Okay. If there's an error, which means we rejected, so we ran out of time to find the dependencies, then it's going to create a custom event with the name of the event of fail. Now with the custom event, if you put in a object as the second property, and that has a detail property, you can put whatever you want on here. I'm just putting error as E. You can put on here, test is test, and it's going to pass that through as part of the event. So whatever you want, you can put on there. But in this case, we're just going to add the error to our detail. Okay, so that's pretty much the dependency check there. And then down in here, what we're doing is, where are we? Okay, so that's pretty much the code. And then down in here, all we're doing is saying check for the dependencies, in this case jQuery and GSAP. If it's loaded, let's change that to success. Success sounds better than loaded, so success for jQuery. Probably should put GSAP on there as well. Make it make sense. So as long as these match, they'll work. So we're checking for jQuery and GSAP. On success, we want to say start of code in it. On fail, we want to get the E, detail error, and debug that as an error. So remember up here, we ran the event on fail, the detail error. So up here, we're running the debug with the E, the event, detail error. Okay. Now, I'm just going to save that and just make sure it's still working. So I get back to my console. I've still got all of that. Now, let's say I took this, oops, problem with working with these small screens so everyone can see it. I'm going to cut that GSAP out of there and save. All right, so see that there? So I did a check in 200 milliseconds. So I did an initial check, 200 milliseconds later, did another check, another check, another check, another check, another check. Dependencies not found. So it's throwing the error, which is what it's doing here. Okay, so I can put here maybe fail plus E. Okay, and then the here. Failed. Failed plus missing dependencies. Okay, so that was because up here I've rejected with missing dependencies. I've also got a debug here. That's why I got the second one. So probably I'll leave that there because it doesn't really matter. But that's pretty much as simple as it is. Now I've taken GSAP out of here. If I want to take that out as a dependency, save, all dependencies are there. Put it back in. GSAP keeps checking, dependencies are not there. That again. Put GSAP back in, and all my dependencies are there. So because I'm looking for jQuery and GSAP. Down here I'm loading jQuery and GSAP. It works. But if I don't have either one of these, then I'm going to get a fail. Now, I think this is a really good way to do it. Now, I think the best thing for me with this is the fact that this bit here, so let's say you're doing a lot of work, but it doesn't have, I wouldn't say you'd use jQuery and GSAP together, but let's say you're doing scroll trigger, maybe scroll trigger. So if you're using scroll trigger there, let's have a look. Okay, so I think it's so scroll trigger. Get some details on this. Where do you get it from? CDN. Okay, let's go to a CDN here. And let's grab this from. I find the CDN. There we go. I'm going to grab scroll trigger here, and I'm going to stick that instead of jQuery as a dependency. So I think that needs to go after GSAP. Let's just stick it in there. Okay, now I think that adds the scroll trigger object to the window. So let's have a look for scroll trigger and GSAP. Update these so they make sense. Okay. Maybe I'll make this an error by putting an extra R on the end of it. Okay, check, not found. Now I know that scroll trigger and GSAP have loaded, so I can run my script. So once I've done this, I could go anywhere and I can add, for example, here, I'll grab this event that I'm throwing. I'll come back to my, where am I? Might be there, go there. I can actually look for success of that. And then I can run some code here to GSAP to, whatever it is. So I know that GSAP's loaded when I run that. Now this could be on another widget. So if I grab that and I get another HTML widget and stick that down there, I know that's going to work because this other one's loaded before that. This is going to work. Or if this script here was loaded in a code snippet or Elementor custom code or whatever, and I know that's already loaded, so I'm checking I want to run anything that relies on both scroll trigger and GSAP. We'll fire this event when it's loaded. I can then go to anywhere and I've got window add event listener, listen for that, and then run my code, and I know that it's going to work. So I think it's a pretty eloquent way of doing it. I'll put a bit of thought into this. If you think it's wrong or disagree with this, I'd love to hear feedback on how I can improve this, but I'm pretty happy with how that works. So let me know what you think.